The station shook before anyone told me why. I was standing in a corridor made of pale metal, 3 steps behind a guide who refused to look at me, when the whole floor trembled under my boots, and every light along the wall dimmed for exactly 2 seconds. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. That was the strange part. On Earth, a tremor like that would have sent a crowd into motion. Here, the beings around me simply paused, the way you pause when a sound reminds you of something you would rather forget. My name is Mira Kessler, and 4 hours earlier I had been the least important person on a very large ship. Now I was the only human being inside a station older than written history, walking toward a chair that had been waiting for someone like me for 200 years. Nobody had explained that part yet either. The guide beside me was tall, built like a heron if a heron were made of dark glass, with eyes that shifted color depending on how nervous it was. Right now, those eyes were the color of a bruise. It had introduced itself as Velen, an aide to the council, and it had spoken exactly 9 words to me since I stepped off the shuttle. Follow. Do not touch the walls. Almost there. I wanted to ask about the tremor. I wanted to ask about a lot of things. Instead, I kept walking, because somewhere behind us I could hear other footsteps, quick and light, and I had already learned that the beings on this station did not like to be watched while they were afraid. We reached a set of doors taller than any building I had stood beside as a child. They opened without sound, which felt wrong, because everything about this moment should have come with some kind of noise. A drum roll, a warning. Instead, there was only silence, and then a room so large that my mind refused to measure it correctly. The council chamber was shaped like a circle within a circle, and every seat was occupied by something that did not come from Earth. Some had skin like polished stone, some seemed to be made of moving light, held together by discipline alone. One delegate near the back had no visible face at all, only a slow rolling mist that occasionally formed the suggestion of eyes. And in the center of it all, closest to where the true business of the galaxy apparently happened, sat one empty chair. It was smaller than the others, plain, almost apologetic in its simplicity, as if whoever built it had been embarrassed to make it stand out. A strip of pale light traced its edges, the same pale light that traced every other occupied seat in the room. That detail told me something before anyone spoke a single word to me. This chair was not forgotten. It was maintained. Someone had been polishing an empty seat for 2 centuries. Velen guided me to a smaller platform off to the side, not the empty chair itself, and gestured for me to stand. I did, spine straight, hands folded the way my mother taught me to stand when I was being judged by people who already believed they knew the answer before I opened my mouth. A voice rolled out from somewhere above the chamber, translated instantly into words I understood, though the emotion behind it did not fully survive the translation. Human representative, you stand before the Concordance Council. Do you understand the honor being extended to you? I did not understand it. I understood that a council of alien governments had sent a ship to Earth 11 days earlier, that the ship had requested exactly 1 passenger, and that the passenger had to be a direct descendant of someone named Helen Kessler. I understood that my grandmother, who died when I was 9 years old, was apparently famous somewhere in the galaxy, and that nobody on my planet had known that until 11 days ago. I said the only honest thing I could say. I understand that I have more questions than answers. A ripple went through the chamber. Not laughter exactly, but something adjacent to it, quickly suppressed. One of the stone-skinned delegates leaned toward another and made a low clicking sound. The mist-faced delegate at the back did not move at all, and somehow that stillness felt louder than anything else in the room. The voice from above continued. For 211 of your years, this council has maintained a seat for your species. It has never been filled. It has never been offered to another race, though many have asked, and some have demanded. You are here because circumstances no longer allow us the comfort of leaving it empty. I looked at the small, plain chair with its careful strip of light, and something in my chest tightened. Why was it kept empty? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. Instead, an elderly delegate rose from the outer ring, moving slowly, joints or the alien equivalent of joints, creaking with something between age and reluctance. Its skin had the gray, layered texture of old riverbed stone, and its eyes, when they finally settled on me, held an expression I recognized instantly because I had seen it on human faces before, in hospital corridors, in courtrooms, in rooms where people were forced to look at something they had spent years trying to avoid. Fear, wearing the calm mask of formality. "I am Doran Vask," the elder said, "and I was present at the beginning of this chair's existence. I would prefer to say nothing further today." "Then why speak at all?" said another voice, sharper, younger, from across the chamber. A slim delegate, with faceted skin like cut glass, stood up, clearly frustrated by the caution around her. "If we are finally seating a human representative, then let us tell her why we feared it for so long." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some sharp, some low and rumbling, in at least 6 languages my translator struggled to keep pace with. I stood in the middle of it, a woman from a small blue planet, watching an argument unfold about my own species as if I were a rumor instead of a person standing directly in front of them. Finally, the voice from above silenced the chamber with a single tone, flat and absolute. "Enough. The full history will not be given today. The representative will be shown to her quarters. Tomorrow, she may ask her questions of the archive, and the archive will answer what it is permitted to answer." I wanted to argue. I wanted to point out that I had crossed unimaginable distance, left behind a planet full of people who thought I had died in a shuttle malfunction because that was the cover story we were told to give, and I deserved more than a single day of waiting. But something in the elder's expression, in the slow, careful way he lowered himself back into his seat, told me that pushing today would close doors that might open tomorrow if I stayed patient. Velen guided me out of the chamber, back through the corridor, past the tremor that nobody had mentioned again, and into a small room built with what I assumed was an attempt at human comfort. A bed too firm, a window showing stars instead of a wall, a chair, ordinary and unremarkable, nothing like the one waiting in that chamber. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally let my hands shake, now that no one important was watching. That was when I noticed the underside of the small table beside the bed. A thin seam, almost invisible, ran along its edge, and beneath it, engraved into a strip of dark alloy, was a short line of text, not in the alien script I had seen everywhere else on the station, in English. "For Helen, so she is never forgotten and never alone." My grandmother's name carved into a piece of alien metal that had clearly sat inside this station for longer than I had been alive. My hands stopped shaking from fear and started shaking from something else entirely, something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground beneath you had never been solid to begin with. I did not know yet what my grandmother had done. I did not know why an empty chair had been kept warm for 2 centuries, polished and lit and never touched, while an entire galaxy avoided looking directly at it. I did not know that the tremor beneath my feet earlier that day had nothing to do with the station itself, and everything to do with something far older, waking up on the far edge of known space, patient and hungry in a way that made ancient civilizations flinch at the memory of it. All I knew, sitting in that small, quiet room with stars where a wall should have been, was that my family carried a secret heavier than I had ever imagined, and that somewhere on this station, an entire council had spent 200 years afraid of what would happen the day someone finally came to claim it. I looked at the carved name one more time, then out at the endless stars, and I made a decision that would define everything that followed. Tomorrow, I was going to get my answers, whether the council wanted to give them to me or not. The archive did not look like I expected. I had imagined rows of glowing shelves, or perhaps a single glowing orb humming with 2 centuries of secrets. Instead, Velen led me into a round room with soft gray walls, and a voice, quieter and less formal than the one from the council chamber, greeted me the moment I stepped inside. "Good morning, Mira Kessler. I have been instructed to answer what I am permitted to answer. I did not waste time on pleasantries. Show me what happened 211 years ago. Show me why the chair exists." The walls dimmed, and light began to gather in the center of the room, folding itself into shapes, then into a scene. I was looking at a version of Earth I barely recognized: older cities, older aircraft, a night sky over an ocean where a single point of light descended slowly, without sound, toward the water. "This is the day your species calls first contact," the archive said. "A scouting vessel from a coalition of 3 allied worlds approached your planet for a standard evaluation. Standard evaluations were, at that time, a peaceful process, a period of observation followed by a period of introduction." The light shape on the screen touched down near a coastline, and figures began to appear on the shore. Human figures, cautious, some armed, some simply curious. I watched a young woman in a uniform I did not recognize step toward the light, hands raised, palms open, exactly the way you would approach a nervous animal. "That is Helen Kessler," the archive said. "Your grandmother. She was 26 years old, and she was the first human to make direct contact with a representative of the coalition." My throat tightened. I had seen photographs of my grandmother as an old woman, gray-haired, gentle, always smelling faintly of lavender soap. I had never once imagined her young, standing on a dark beach, walking toward a light that had fallen out of the sky. "What happened next?" I asked. The scene shifted. The light resolved into a shape, tall and thin, not unlike Velen, and for a moment the two figures simply stood facing each other, neither moving. Then something went wrong. A second craft appeared overhead, larger, and a mechanical error, the archive explained, caused it to release what its systems interpreted as a defensive measure. A pulse of light swept across the beach. "I want to be careful here," the archive said, its tone shifting into something almost gentle. "No lives were lost that night. The pulse was a scanning measure, not a weapon, though your species did not know that at the time, and reacted accordingly." "Reacted how?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. The image sharpened. I watched dozens of human figures on that beach, ordinary people with no equipment that could hope to matter against a craft from the stars, refuse to run. I watched my grandmother stand her ground while the light washed over her, watched her turn to the other people on the beach and shout something the recording could not translate, but that clearly organized them, gave them purpose, turned a crowd of frightened strangers into something coordinated within seconds. Within 1 hour, the archive continued. Every major government on your planet had been contacted through channels the coalition did not expect existed. Within 6 hours, your species had assembled a unified response team, despite having no history of full global cooperation. Within 1 day, that response team had begun studying the coalition's technology, using methods no other species had used at first contact, including deliberately provoking small, controlled reactions from coalition systems in order to learn how they behaved under stress. I sat down slowly in a chair that had appeared behind me without my noticing. "You are saying we studied you back?" The archive paused, and for a machine, that pause felt remarkably human. "Every species the coalition has ever encountered reacted to first contact in one of 2 ways," it said. "Submission, born from fear or hope of protection, or open resistance, born from fear alone. Your species did neither. Your species treated an encounter with a technologically superior civilization as a problem to be solved, calmly, methodically, and with an adaptability that unsettled every observer present." The screen shifted again, showing meetings, discussions, human diplomats sitting across from coalition representatives within weeks of contact, already asking questions about trade, about boundaries, about mutual understanding, as though the shock of learning they were not alone in the universe had simply been absorbed and set aside in favor of practical matters. I did not understand why this would frighten anyone. If anything, it sounded like the best possible outcome. I said as much. The archive was quiet for a long moment before it answered. "Adaptability without limit is difficult to plan around, Mira Kessler. Every civilization in the Concordance has a history of hardship, and every civilization has learned, over centuries, what its neighbors will do when tested. There are patterns, there are expectations, Your species broke every pattern within the first week of contact and continued breaking them for the following 2 centuries. It is difficult to build trust with a species you cannot predict. I thought of my grandmother on that beach, gathering strangers around her within minutes, and felt a strange, quiet pride settle beside my confusion. So the council was cautious of us because we adapted too well. That is part of the reason the seat remained empty, the archive said. There is more. The light on the screen shifted one final time, pulling away from Earth entirely, sweeping outward through a field of stars until it reached a region marked only by a soft red boundary, a place the display seemed almost reluctant to show clearly. 209 years ago, shortly after your species began expanding its presence beyond Earth's system, the Coalition detected an old signal from this region. A signal every member species recognizes, because every member species has lost worlds to what lies beyond that boundary. I leaned forward. What is beyond it? The archive's voice grew careful, measured, the way a doctor speaks before delivering news they know will be difficult to hear. We do not have a full name for it in your language. The closest translation is the quiet, though your grandmother's own reports referred to it as something else. A force, or a system, or perhaps once a civilization, that moves through developed regions of the galaxy at long intervals and removes any presence that has grown too advanced, too coordinated, or too capable of resisting outside control. It does not conquer worlds in the way your stories imagine. It erases the conditions that allow resistance to exist at all, quietly, methodically, leaving very little behind to explain what happened. It noticed the pattern that had formed around your species, the archive said. Rapid adaptation, unprecedented cooperation under pressure. Every trait that made the Coalition uneasy about your species is also, unfortunately, precisely the profile the Quiet has historically searched for first. The Council did not fill the seat, in part because seating your species formally, acknowledging you as a full member of galactic affairs, would draw attention to exactly the qualities most likely to bring the Quiet's notice, sooner rather than later. I sat back, the full weight of it finally settling on me. They hid us, not to protect themselves from us, to protect us, and maybe themselves, from something worse finding us too quickly. That is one interpretation, the archive said. There is a simpler one as well. Caution rarely waits for clean interpretations. Some among the council genuinely believed, and still believe, that your species carries real risk regardless of the Quiet's existence. Doran Vask was among those who argued 2 centuries ago that humanity should never be granted a voice at all, out of concern for what an unpredictable species might do with real influence. Then why is he the one who seemed the most reluctant to speak yesterday? I asked. Reluctance, in my experience, rarely comes from certainty. The archive did not answer that question directly, and something told me it was not able to. I asked instead about my grandmother, about what became of her after that first night on the beach, and the archive showed me years I had never known existed. Helen Kessler, sitting across from Coalition diplomats as a young translator and negotiator, one of a handful of humans trusted with early contact work. Helen Kessler, older now, speaking before an early, informal gathering of Coalition representatives, arguing that humanity deserved patience rather than suspicion. Helen Kessler, older still, present at the exact meeting where the empty chair was first commissioned, standing in a room much like the one I had stood in the day before, declining an offer of immediate full membership on behalf of her entire species. Why would she decline that? I asked, stunned. The archive's answer came slowly. She said humanity was not ready to be handed a seat at a table it did not yet understand. She asked instead that the seat be kept open, waiting, so that whoever eventually filled it would do so because circumstances demanded it, not because anyone offered it out of pity or caution. Her exact words, translated as closely as our systems allow, were recorded as follows. Let the chair stay empty until the day my people are needed for who we truly are, not watched for who you assume we might become. I closed my eyes, picturing a young woman on a beach and an older woman in a council chamber, both refusing to be rushed into an identity someone else had written for her. Then the room shifted again, this time without my asking. Every wall dimmed at once, and a new signal, urgent and unfamiliar, pulsed through the display. The archive's voice changed instantly, losing its careful, gentle tone, replaced by something clipped and alert. Mira Kessler, I must interrupt. A priority alert has just reached this station from the outer monitoring array along the Coalition's farthest border. What kind of alert? I asked, already standing. The same signature detected 209 years ago, the archive said. The boundary marking the Quiet's last known territory has shifted for the first time in recorded history. Something within it has moved. The Council is being summoned to emergency session, and you have been named on the list of required attendees. I stood there for a moment, my grandmother's recorded voice still echoing faintly in my mind, and understood, with a clarity that settled into my bones rather than my thoughts, that the empty chair I had seen the day before was no longer simply a symbol. It was about to be needed for exactly the reason my grandmother had always known it would be. The emergency chamber was smaller than the one I had stood in before, but the tension inside it filled every corner regardless of size. Delegates arrived quickly, some still adjusting robes or plating as they walked, none of them bothering with the slow formality I had witnessed the day before. Whatever patience this council usually practiced had been replaced by something closer to controlled alarm. Velen stayed close to me this time, close enough that I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of whatever passed for its nervous system working overtime. Stand near the archive projection, it said quietly. Do not speak unless asked. This is not a session for outsiders, but you are required regardless. I did not point out the contradiction in that statement. I simply nodded and found my place near a curved display that hummed faintly with old light. The voice from above opened the session without ceremony. Confirmed movement along the outer boundary. The pattern matches historical records from 2 prior incidents, both resulting in the loss of developed systems. Estimated time before contact with the nearest inhabited Coalition world is unknown, though initial models suggest it will not be measured in centuries this time. It may be measured in seasons. A wave of low sound moved through the chamber, something between a groan and a hiss, dozens of species expressing dread in whatever manner their bodies allowed. I felt my own pulse pick up, though I forced myself to stay still, remembering what I had learned only hours earlier about how this room reacted to visible fear. Doran Vask rose from his seat again, slower than before, his gray, layered skin seeming to sag slightly under some invisible weight. We have faced this signature twice in recorded memory, he said. Twice, we prepared our strongest fleets, our most disciplined defenses, our most careful strategies. Twice, entire worlds were lost regardless, because the Quiet does not fight the way we expect an enemy to fight. It does not seek confrontation. It removes the conditions that allow resistance before resistance can properly form. Then what would you have us do? Snapped the sharp-voiced delegate from the day before, the one with faceted, glass-like skin. Wait quietly for our worlds to fall in careful order? I would have us consider, Doran Vask said, that our existing strategies have failed twice, and that perhaps the reason lies in our own predictability. Every Coalition world plans according to doctrine passed down for centuries. Every fleet formation, every defensive posture, every diplomatic contingency has been documented, studied, and, I suspect, anticipated by whatever intelligence guides the Quiet's movements. He turned, slowly, and for the first time since I had arrived on the station, looked directly at me. There is one variable in this council's long history that has never been fully modeled, he said. One species whose patterns even our finest analysts could not predict with confidence. I opposed her seat for 2 centuries because I feared what unpredictability might cost us if given power carelessly. I find myself now wondering whether that same unpredictability is the only advantage remaining to us. The chamber fell silent in a way that felt different from before, less angry, more uncertain, the kind of silence that comes when people realize an argument they have repeated for years might no longer serve them. The sharp-voiced delegate turned toward me, her faceted eyes catching the light strangely. You wish to gamble the safety of this concordance on one small, unproven species. I am not proposing a gamble, Doran Vask said. I am proposing an honest acknowledgement. This council commissioned a seat 2 centuries ago and left it empty out of caution. Caution has not protected us. It has only delayed a conversation we now have no choice but to finish. All eyes turned toward me, and for a moment I felt the full, dizzying weight of representing an entire planet that had not chosen me for this, that did not even know most of what I had learned in the past 2 days. I am not authorized to commit my planet to anything, I said carefully. I came here as an observer, not a commander. Whatever Earth chooses to do, it will choose for itself. Then reach your planet, the voice from above said. Immediately. Time is not something this council can offer generously. I was led to a small communication chamber within the hour, a quiet room with a single console glowing faintly blue, built, Velen explained, using a translation protocol adapted specifically for human transmissions decades earlier, in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. Someone, long before I was born, had prepared for the day this conversation would need to happen quickly. The signal took several long minutes to establish, minutes I spent pacing, rehearsing words that all sounded inadequate the moment I imagined saying them aloud. How do you explain, in a short transmission, that your species has been secretly known to the galaxy for 2 centuries, that your grandmother helped shape that secrecy, and that an ancient, world-ending pattern is now moving toward inhabited space faster than anyone expected? When the connection finally opened, it was not a diplomat who answered, nor a president, nor a general. It was a calm, familiar voice belonging to a coordination officer named Grace Linden, someone I had met briefly during preparation for this mission, practical and unshakable in the way only people who have spent years managing emergencies can be. "Mira," she said, her voice steady despite the distance and static in the signal. "We received the outline the Coalition sent ahead. Command has been in continuous session since it arrived. What do you need from us?" I gave her the short version, the version stripped of everything except what mattered. An ancient threat was moving faster than any historical model predicted. The Coalition's traditional strategies had failed twice already. Some among the Council believed humanity's unpredictability, the very trait that had kept our seat empty for 2 centuries, might be the one advantage no existing doctrine could counter. "They are asking whether Earth is willing to stand with them," I said. "Not ordered, asked. I do not know what that will cost us if we say yes." There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy, the kind of pause that exists in every important decision right before it is made. Then Grace Linden's voice returned, quieter now, but without hesitation. "We have spent 200 years being watched instead of known," she said. "Whatever this costs, hiding was never going to be free either. Tell them yes." "I need something more specific to bring back," I said, though something in my chest had already begun to steady itself, as if it had been waiting for exactly this kind of answer. Grace Linden's response came a moment later, simple, direct, exactly the kind of clarity I had come to associate with people who understood that some decisions did not require lengthy explanation. "Tell them we are ready." I carried those 2 words back through the corridors of the station like something fragile, repeating them silently until I stood once more before the full council, every delegate waiting, some with open doubt still written across their features, others with something closer to cautious hope. I delivered the message exactly as it had been given to me. Earth is ready. The chamber did not erupt into celebration. There was no applause, no triumphant fanfare, nothing that resembled the moment I might have imagined as a child reading old stories about first contact and daring rescues. Instead, there was a long, careful stillness, followed by the quiet, deliberate sound of the voice from above issuing new instructions. "Then let the preparations begin," it said. "Human vessels will be granted passage through Coalition space under emergency provision. Human commanders will be included in strategic planning at the highest available level, and the seat reserved for Earth in this chamber will no longer remain a symbol. It will be filled, formally, the moment this crisis reaches its conclusion, regardless of outcome." Doran Vask looked at me once more, his ancient eyes carrying something that had not been there the day before, something closer to respect than fear, though the two had clearly lived side by side inside him for longer than I could imagine. "I hope your grandmother's patience proves as wise now as it did then," he said quietly, meant, I suspected, only for me. "So do I answered, and meant it completely." Outside the chamber, far beyond the station's calm artificial light, something ancient and patient continued moving through the dark, unaware or uncaring that the one species it had never managed to predict was finally being given the chance to prove exactly how dangerous that unpredictability could be, not to the galaxy that had feared it, but to the thing that had never once considered it might need to. 3 days later, I stood on an observation deck overlooking a stretch of open space that had, until recently, only ever been described to me in reports and quiet, worried briefings. Now it was filled with ships, human ships, arriving in formations that made several coalition officers beside me visibly uncomfortable. The lead officer nearest to me was a broad-shouldered being named Torel San, plated in deep blue armor that shifted slightly with every breath, commanding one of the coalition's primary defense fleets. He had greeted me politely enough upon my arrival, though his eyes kept drifting toward the human formations with an expression I recognized instantly, the look of someone watching a plan unfold that did not match anything in the manual they had studied their entire career. "Your ships are not aligning correctly," he said, more observation than complaint. "Coalition doctrine calls for a unified front, evenly spaced, mutually supporting. Your vessels are spreading into smaller, uneven clusters. It appears disorganized." "It is not disorganized," I said, though I will admit I did not fully understand the reasoning myself until I watched it unfold. "It is adaptive. Give it time." Grace Linden's voice came through the shared communication channel a moment later, calm and clear, addressing both human and coalition officers at once. "Command to all units, hold cluster formation. Let them commit to a pattern before we reveal ours." Torel San frowned, his plated brow shifting in a way I had learned, over the past 3 days, indicated confusion rather than displeasure. "Reveal what pattern? There is no pattern. Your ships are simply scattered." I did not answer, because at that exact moment, sensors across the observation deck lit up with the first confirmed detection of the Quiet's advanced presence. Not a fleet in any traditional sense, but something closer to a slow, deliberate spread of dark, angular shapes moving through open space with an eerie, unified silence. I had expected fear to hit me the moment I saw it directly for the first time. Instead, what settled over me was something colder and more focused, the same feeling I imagined my grandmother must have felt standing on that beach 2 centuries earlier, refusing to let instinct override judgment. The Coalition's long-range scanners struggled to interpret the approaching shapes clearly. "They do not broadcast identification," a nearby technician reported, voice tight with tension. "They do not respond to standard hailing protocols. Estimated numbers are difficult to confirm. They appear to reorganize their formation every time our scanners adjust focus, as though reacting to being observed." "That confirms the old reports," Torel San said grimly. "It adapts to prediction. The moment we commit to a strategy, it shifts to counter it." "Then we will not give it a single strategy to counter," Grace Linden's voice replied over the channel, steady, despite the scale of what approached. "Human fleet, initiate first sequence." What followed was unlike anything Torel San or his officers had trained for. The human clusters, which had appeared scattered and uneven only moments earlier, began moving independently, each group adjusting speed, spacing, and heading based on constantly shifting calculations relayed between smaller command teams rather than a single central authority. There was no single formation to counter, because there was no single formation at all, only dozens of smaller decisions being made simultaneously, each one reacting not just to the Quiet's movements, but to the movements of other human clusters as well. I watched the dark, angular shapes shift in response, attempting to close gaps that no longer existed by the time they reached them, redirecting toward clusters that had already relocated, spreading themselves thin in an attempt to counter a pattern that refused to remain a pattern for more than a few seconds at a time. "It is not committing fully to any single approach," Terrell Sand said, disbelief evident in his voice. "It is being forced to react instead of predict." "That is the idea," I said quietly, watching the display with a strange, quiet pride swelling steadily beneath my nerves. The engagement that followed was unlike the historical records I had studied over the previous days, records filled with heavy formations meeting the Quiet's advance head-on and being slowly, methodically overwhelmed. Instead, I watched human clusters draw sections of the dark formation away from the main body, isolating smaller portions, using coordinated feints that risked individual ships in exchange for creating openings elsewhere, sacrifices calculated carefully enough that no single loss went unanswered by an immediate, adjusted response from nearby clusters. At one point, a human cluster appeared to retreat directly into a narrowing gap between two larger sections of the Quiet's advance, a move that made Terrell Sand visibly tense beside me. "That formation is retreating into an enclosed position," he said sharply. "That is not a retreat. It is a trap being sprung on itself." "Wait," I said, though I understood only slightly more than he did at that moment, trusting instead in something I had come to recognize over the past several days as distinctly, stubbornly human. The cluster did not remain trapped. Instead, as the two sections of dark shapes closed inward to contain it, 3 additional human clusters, previously scattered far from the engagement, arrived from unexpected angles, converging on the closing formation from outside its field of adjustment. The trap meant to contain a single human cluster became, within moments, an opportunity for 4 clusters working together to isolate and neutralize a significant portion of the Quiet's advance before it could reorganize. Terrell Sand said nothing for a long moment, watching the display with an expression I had only seen once before, on Doran Vask's face, the moment fear and respect finally settled into something resembling understanding. "It sacrificed one position to create 3 openings," he finally said, more to himself than to me. "It did not fight to hold ground. It fought to create choices, and it made those choices faster than the enemy could adjust to losing them." "That is what my grandmother called adapting under pressure," I said quietly. "We do not fight to win a single battle the way your doctrine expects. We fight to keep changing the battle itself until whatever we face runs out of ways to keep up." Over the following hours, the pattern repeated itself again and again, smaller human clusters drawing sections of the advance apart, isolating them, allowing coordinated coalition support fleets to finish neutralizing what remained once the Quiet's forces had been separated from the safety of their unified formation. It was not a swift victory. It was slow, careful, occasionally costly, marked by moments where I gripped the railing of the observation deck hard enough that my knuckles ached, watching individual human ships take on risks that made my chest tighten with worry I refused to let show on my face. But it worked. Section by section, the dark, angular advance that had erased entire worlds twice before in recorded history found itself unable to settle into any stable formation long enough to overwhelm the forces arrayed against it. By the time the engagement finally slowed, then stopped altogether, the remaining fragments of the Quiet's advance had withdrawn deeper into the boundary it came from, retreating for what the Coalition's analysts confirmed was the first time in recorded memory. Terrell Sand stood beside me in silence for a long moment after the last confirmed retreat signal came through, his plated shoulders slowly relaxing from a tension I suspected he had carried for most of his career. "We have feared this encounter for centuries," he said finally. "We built doctrine after doctrine trying to predict something that could not be predicted, because that was the only tool we understood. Your species did not try to out-predict it. It simply refused to be predictable at all." I thought of Doran Vask's words in the emergency chamber, of my grandmother refusing an easy seat 2 centuries earlier, of Grace Linden's calm voice delivering 2 simple words across an unimaginable distance, and felt, for the first time since arriving at the station, something settle fully into place inside me. We were never trying to be unpredictable, I said quietly. We were only ever trying to keep choosing, even when every choice looked impossible. It turns out that habit was worth more than anyone expected, including us. Toril Sand turned to look at me fully then, his expression unreadable in the way only alien faces can remain unreadable even after days of familiarity, and said something that I would carry with me long after that day ended. Then perhaps the seat your people were given was never meant to remain empty out of fear alone, he said. Perhaps some part of this council always understood that the day would come when the galaxy needed exactly what it once feared the most. Below us, human and coalition vessels alike began the long, careful process of regrouping, tending to what needed tending, preparing reports that would need to be delivered honestly rather than triumphantly, because everyone present understood, without needing to say it aloud, that what had happened here was not a final victory. It was proof, and proof, I was quickly learning, changed everything that came after it. 2 weeks passed before the council convened again in full formal session, and in that time, I barely recognized my own life anymore. Reports moved between Earth and the Coalition station faster than I could read them. Grace Linden's voice became a near-constant presence in my communications, coordinating recovery efforts, casualty accounts, and the delicate, exhausting work of translating a single, chaotic engagement into language calm enough for both human and coalition leadership to absorb without panic. I slept poorly during those 2 weeks, not from fear, but from the strange, disorienting weight of realizing that everything my grandmother had quietly protected, an entire species' right to be understood on its own terms rather than judged from a distance, now rested visibly, permanently, in the open. On the morning of the formal session, Velen arrived at my quarters earlier than usual, its eyes a calm, steady green I had not seen from it before. "The council is ready," it said simply, "and so, I believe, are you." I did not feel ready in any way I could easily describe, but I followed regardless, walking the same corridor I had walked 2 weeks earlier as a stranger, and arriving this time at doors that opened, once again, without sound, though everything else about the moment felt entirely different. The chamber was full, every delegate present, along with several I did not recognize, representatives from smaller coalition worlds who had apparently traveled considerable distances specifically to witness this particular session. Toril Sand stood near the entrance, offering a small, respectful nod as I passed, an acknowledgement that would have seemed unremarkable anywhere else, but here, from a career officer of his standing, felt like its own quiet form of ceremony. Doran Vask waited near the center of the chamber, standing beside the small, plain chair with its careful strip of pale light, looking, for the first time since I had met him, less burdened than before, as though some old weight he had carried for 2 centuries had finally been allowed to settle. The voice from above opened the session, though it spoke with a different tone than I remembered from before, less clinical, closer to something resembling solemn respect. 211 years ago, this council reserved a place for a species it did not yet understand, choosing caution over acknowledgement, distance over inclusion. That caution was never born from malice. It was born from fear, honestly held, by beings who had seen entire worlds erased by patterns they could not predict, and who did not know, at the time, whether humanity represented a similar unpredictable danger, or something the galaxy would one day desperately need. I stood quietly, listening, aware of every delegate's attention resting on me, though for once it did not feel like scrutiny, it felt like witness. "We now have our answer," the voice continued. "Humanity's unpredictability, the very trait this council once feared enough to leave a seat empty for over 2 centuries, proved to be the one advantage no historical strategy against the quiet ever possessed. It did not win through strength alone, nor through numbers, nor through any doctrine this council had previously written. It won by refusing to be reduced to a pattern at all, adapting continuously, trusting individual judgment as much as collective strategy, treating cooperation not as a rigid structure to maintain, but as something reshaped constantly to fit whatever moment demanded. Doran Vask stepped forward then, addressing the chamber directly, his voice steady in a way that carried the particular calm of someone who has finally set down something heavy. "I opposed this seat being filled for longer than any other member of this council," he said. "I believed, honestly and without malice, that a species capable of adapting so quickly, so completely, represented a risk too great to invite fully into our affairs. I was not entirely wrong to be cautious, but I was wrong to believe caution alone was wisdom. Wisdom, I have learned rather late in a very long life, sometimes requires trusting exactly the quality that frightens you most, at exactly the moment you least want to." He turned to me, gesturing toward the small, plain chair beside him. "Mira Kessler, granddaughter of Helen Kessler, the woman who first asked this council to wait, rather than assume, I do not believe there has ever been a more appropriate moment, nor a more appropriate representative, to finally fill the place your people have waited for, since long before you were born." I stepped forward slowly, aware of every eye in the chamber, aware of the strange, quiet hum of the pale light tracing the chair's edges, aware, most of all, of the small engraved words I had found beneath a bedside table 2 weeks earlier, carved by someone who had clearly understood, long before I did, exactly how this moment would eventually arrive. I sat down carefully, and the moment I did, the strip of light along the chair's edge shifted subtly in color, matching, for the first time, the light traced around every other occupied seat in the chamber. The voice from above spoke once more, quieter now, almost gentle. "Let it be recorded, across every world represented in this concordance, that the seat reserved for Earth is no longer empty, and that it was filled not out of pity, nor convenience, nor fear, but because circumstance finally revealed what patience alone could not prove. Humanity is not simply capable of standing among us. Humanity is capable of holding a portion of this galaxy's future steady, precisely because it refuses to be predicted, refuses to be reduced, and refuses, even now, to be anything other than exactly what it chooses to become in each new moment it is given." A quiet murmur moved through the chamber, not celebration exactly, but something warmer than the tense silence I remembered from my first day here, something closer to relief, shared collectively among beings who had spent 2 centuries uncertain whether this day would ever come, or whether it would arrive only alongside disaster. Afterward, once the formal proceedings ended and delegates began filing out in smaller groups, quieter conversations replacing the weight of ceremony, Doran Vask approached me directly, standing beside the chair I now occupied as though it had always been mine to claim. "Your grandmother once told me something I did not fully understand at the time," he said. "She said that fear and respect often begin as the same feeling, and that the only difference between them is whether you allow yourself enough patience to see which one it eventually becomes. I did not understand that for a very long time. I believe I finally do. I thought of Helen Kessler standing on a dark beach 2 centuries earlier, of her sitting across from cautious diplomats decades later, of her quietly declining an offer she believed her people were not yet ready to accept, choosing instead to trust a future she would never personally witness." "She would have liked hearing you say that," I said honestly. "She spent her whole life trying to convince people that patience and courage were not opposites. I do not think she ever expected proof to arrive quite this dramatically." Doran Vask allowed something close to a smile, an expression I had not thought his face capable of forming until that exact moment. "Few important truths announce themselves quietly," he said. "Perhaps that is simply the nature of truths worth waiting 2 centuries to confirm." Later that evening, standing once more on the same observation deck where I had watched impossible odds turn slowly, carefully, into something resembling hope, Grace Linden's voice reached me through a private channel, calm as always, though carrying a warmth I had not heard from her before. "Command wanted me to tell you something directly," she said. "Earth is proud of you, Mira, not because of what happened out there, though that matters enormously, because you walked into a room full of strangers who had spent 2 centuries deciding what to believe about us, and you simply told them the truth, again and again, until the truth became impossible to ignore. I did not know how to answer that fully, so I simply thanked her quietly, watching starlight scatter softly across the observation deck's transparent barrier, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something like calm settle over the exhaustion that had followed me since I first stepped off that shuttle. I might have stayed there far longer, lost in that rare, quiet stillness, if Velen had not arrived a short while later, its eyes shifting quickly between colors I had learned, over the past weeks, to associate with urgency rather than calm. "Mira Kessler," it said, "forgive the interruption, the monitoring array has detected something new." I turned, feeling the familiar tightening return to my chest, though this time it arrived alongside something steadier than fear. "What kind of something?" I asked. "A signal," Velen said, "though not from the region we have been watching. This one originates from an entirely different sector, one previously believed dormant. Early analysis suggests a pattern similar to what we encountered recently, though the point of origin has never appeared in Coalition records before." I looked out at the vast, quiet stretch of stars beyond the station, thinking of my grandmother's careful patience, of Doran Vask's slow, hard-earned respect, of a small human fleet that had refused to be predictable even when facing something ancient enough to have erased entire worlds twice before, and felt, beneath the exhaustion, something unmistakably like readiness settling into place instead. "Then I suppose," I said quietly, "we had better find out exactly what we are dealing with this time." Velen's eyes shifted once more, this time toward a color I recognized instantly, because I had come to associate it, over these strange, exhausting, extraordinary weeks, with something very close to hope. "I will inform the council immediately," it said. "I suspect they will want your seat filled for this conversation as well." I looked one last time at the stars, scattered endlessly beyond the station, thought briefly of a young woman on a dark beach 2 centuries earlier who had refused to run when the universe first arrived uninvited, and allowed myself, finally, a small, steady breath before turning to follow Velen back toward whatever waited next. The chair, after 211 years, was no longer empty, and for the first time since I had arrived, I understood completely why the galaxy had once trembled at the thought of finally filling it.